So in this next chapter of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, we have the analytic of concepts proper, chapter 2, the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding. And in this chapter, what Kant is going to do is he wants to ask the question is, how subjective knowledge can make objective knowledge possible? How is it that the a priori categories of the understanding can make knowledge possible? That's the deduction. He says that the deduction is a term that he's borrowed from legal theory, in which you have to prove either the facts of a case, which is quid facti, or the question of right in a case, quid juris. And the proving of the question of right, quid juris, is called a deduction. So it's a justification of right, or violation of right. And what he's going to do is, in borrowing this from legal theory, he's going then to proceed to a justification of the categories and the fact and how. Basically a model. He's going to give us a model of the machinery for how the understanding applies its a priori categories to outer phenomena, to the phenomena given to us through the sensory manifold. And in doing so, he's going to move into his theory of the self. He'll dig up his idea of what he thinks the self is, a fancy term for it, which he'll call the transcendental unity of apperception, which we'll see in a moment. And he's going to do this also by, even though this is a long and complex chapter, it basically boils down to a discussion of his model of the way the machinery of the human mind works in terms of three different faculties. Sensibility, we've already seen the pure forms of sensibility as space-time, on the one hand, and the understanding on the other, and in between them is a middle faculty which he calls the imagination, which shuttles back and forth between sensibility and the understanding, almost like the Holy Ghost in the Trinity, or Hermes, who shuttled back and forth between the gods and men in the ancient epics. This is what the imagination does, and it's the function that makes possible the way in which the concepts of the understanding can confer synthetic unity on the manifold of the diversity of representations that are presented to the subject in learning, in knowledge, in having scientific knowledge. So he wants to know then how this is possible. And the first thing that he does is he talks about three different types of syntheses, two of which are performed by the imagination and the third by the understanding. And the first of these syntheses is the synthesis of apprehension and intuition. Basically, he says what happens is that the imagination renders the intuition, the faculty of sensibility, with the forms of which are space-time, renders them stable and organizes and apprehends the representations that they take in, the intuitions from the outer world. It renders them in such a way as to create a stable world image, so that we don't just have a chaos as we're walking down the street and we look out. We don't just see this chaotic welter of things coming at us. The imagination apprehends through the flow of time. Time is the form of the inner sense, and these intuitions come flowing through this inner sense in such a way that the imagination organizes the sensory manifold, confers a certain synthetic unity upon it by creating a stable world image that flows through time. This is a little bit like the Hindu theory of chitta. In Hindu metaphysics, the mind is called chitta, and the mind is made up of a subtle matter that, when it looks out upon the world, actually takes on the forms of the external world, and when you're asleep, this chitta keeps moving and keeps forming its own forms. It's a little bit like that, although that's a much more receptive, passive epistemological theory than Kant's, which is a very Faustian, active, dynamic theory about how the mind dictates to phenomena and tyrannizes over it and forces the outer world basically to conform to its dictates, as I think Heidegger would criticize it. For Heidegger tones all of this kind of thing down and really puts the emphasis on, in the clearing, how entities show themselves forth to us, and there's a dialogue there, and it's not so much a tyranny the way that Kant portrays it here, of the intellect over nature. He says that the laws of nature are not in nature, they're in the human mind, and they're dictated to nature by the human mind through this following process of these three syntheses. The second of these syntheses is the synthesis of reproduction in imagination, and this is another function that imagination does. In apprehending these outer intuitions, it has to organize them in such a way that it provides basically a short-term memory, which is basically another word for what he's talking about here. There has to be continuity. The world image that we have, when we take it in, there has to be a certain amount of continuity, and you have to remember things. If you're in the middle of drawing a line, you have to remember where you're at. If you're in the middle of counting up to 10, you have to remember the previous numbers. Pot smoking, by the way, this is precisely the function of the mind that pot smoking disrupts and undercuts, in which you can find yourself in the middle of an activity and all of a sudden you have no idea where you were at. The continuity is gone. So this is a real thing here that Kant is talking about. It's basically short-term memory, and he says that it's conferred upon the mind by the imagination. This reproduction, the mind's ability to reproduce intuitions, images and intuitions in an accurate way that's stable and consistent and continuous. Then the third synthesis is the synthesis of recognition in the concept. And this involves not so much the imagination as it does the imagination's relation to another faculty which he now calls the unity of apperception. And apperception was a word he had introduced earlier in order to indicate the mind's way of perceiving itself. It's a kind of self-perception. But he distinguishes here between empirical apperception, which is basically the stream of consciousness. If I try to become aware of myself, and this happens in yoga, let's say if you want to meditate, you close your eyes, the first thing you become aware of is the stream of thoughts, memories, intuitions, associations, and it's an unstable stream where there's no apparent fixity of self. The Buddhists will say that's precisely the point. There is no stable self through that flux. We are only that flux. Not so in the Western tradition. For Kant, that empirical apperception is not what matters. What gives it its fixity is a fundamental unity of consciousness that unifies all of the other perceptions that we have and give them a stability. And that unity of apperception is basically his fancy word for the self. This is sort of self in itself almost. It's that he calls it the transcendental unity of apperception. It's transcendental because it provides the ultimate ground, the ultimate a priori ground that makes possible the understanding's application of the categories to the sensory material that have come through the faculty of sensibility and intuition that has been readied by the imagination in an a priori manner and presented it to the faculty of the unity of apperception, the transcendental unity of apperception, which is basically the self, the unity of consciousness, that applies and awakens the understanding. The understanding is basically the function of the a priori concepts that comes to awakening in between the fiction, as it were, of the syntheses of the imagination rubbing up against the unity of apperception, as it were. This brings and awakens the understanding, which is rooted in the unity of apperception, almost like a flower in soil, and awakens the concepts which then begin to apply them, and you have recognition. So I suppose in a simple, banal way, if we go back to Schopenhauer's idea that all of this is really just about common everyday consciousness organizing a stable world around, if I'm walking down the street, this sense of unity of apperception, giving this synthesis of recognition in a concept, it just means that I'm able to recognize everything I see, that car, that building, that tree. And that ability to recognize those things gives me a stability of consciousness that organizes a world around that isn't a threat to me. It's not, if I was walking down the street and my mind was not able to recognize the things that I saw, I would be in a state of abject terror. Everything would be creepy and completely alien, which, by the way, is precisely the function of art. That's what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to rupture all of those comfortable concepts which enable you to recognize things by disrupting your mind's ability to confer easy recognition on the signifiers with strange and alien. It steps up the environment by transforming it into something bizarre, strange, and alien that is not immediately recognizable, and the shock of which is meant to rupture you out of your sense of complacency and provide an aesthetic counter-environment that gets the mind working in a new way. So art precisely does the opposite of what he's talking about here, about this recognition, the mind's ability to recognize the world. But this is also the condition for all knowledge. And so these are the three syntheses that make possible our experience of the world, our ability to have any kind of knowledge in terms of scientific knowledge about the external world, knowledge about appearances. And he also introduces a concept here that he calls the transcendental object. He says there that the appearances that we have and the intuitions within the appearances, which are the faculty of sensation in us, that provides us with these intuitions that come from appearances of the outer world, the phenomenal outer world, also have an outer objective correlate, which is basically the realm of things in themselves, which is not accessible to human intuition, and which he calls the transcendental object X, that gives to the object its outer stability, perhaps. He doesn't go into much detail about it. But it's the thing in itself in the outer world that we can't know, it's object X, that gives the object its sense of outer stability, just as the transcendental unity of apperception of the self in the inner world gives to one's consciousness a fixity and stability, basically like the Cartesian cogito that it would otherwise not have, and therefore give it transcendental a priori, gives it the basis to apply all of its categories, its pre-existent a priori categories, to phenomena in the outer world and to make sense out of them. So the laws of nature do not exist for Kant in nature. They come from the human mind, and they are dictated to nature by the human mind. They're not in nature. They're in us. And that is the main point of this chapter, is this introduction of the Kantian self as the transcendental unity of apperception, giving the justification for the deduction of the concepts of the understanding, giving them their a priori legitimacy. So we have this fixed, stable self in the mode of what Heidegger would call Vorhandenheit, the self-sufficient, the self as a self-sufficient entity unto itself that dictates to phenomena the laws of how the world will be. This is, of course, the Western idea of the self. The West's idea of the self as an aggressive form of consciousness that dictates to nature and not really interested in being the pupil of nature, but rather its instructor. And also the idea, there's also another sense in which a transcendental object, not the transcendental object X out there, but what Kant is constructing here, or what it proceed to construct, is the transcendental scientific object X. That is to say, he's constructing the architecture for what can be any possible object of science. It's an a priori possible object. So it's a different type of transcendental object X from the thing in itself. It's the object that he's constructing here in a pure form that's denuded of all sensory content and all empirical data. It's pure object X that is the basis for the sciences to study phenomena and gives them the basis for the construction of all these a priori laws and so forth. It comes from the study of this object X. So he's basically saying this is any object for scientific knowledge is made possible by these a priori categories and judgments and the a priori forms of space-time that the mind dictates to phenomena in the outer world.